Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Kerridge and Partners webinar series. My name is Renisa Peterson and I'm a consultant with the firm. As part of our vision to transform the leadership landscape, we have been working on a series of leadership events, including this webinar series. Thank you to everyone who has been attending our webinar series over the last few months. They have certainly picked up momentum and sparked conversations online, spanning topics on leadership in crisis, talent development, CEO succession, and more recently, a series of leadership conversations with leaders who bring a global and local lens. We are delighted you are joining us today for a discussion with Ziena Jalil. Ziena is a brand, public relations and communications strategist with global experiences, particularly throughout the Asia Pacific. Ziena has received several international awards for her work promoting New Zealand trade, investment and education in Asia, where she was based for 10 years. She had a long career with NZTE, including as head of marketing and communications North Asia, based in Hong Kong, and as trade commissioner for Singapore. Her decade in Asia entailed the duties of a New Zealand diplomat with an NZ Inc. focus, including networking with key stakeholders in business and government. Returning to New Zealand, she has done projects with Asia New Zealand Foundation, Tuputoa, the internship program for Māori and Pacific students, and is a consulting partner with PR agency Senate. She is a member of Super Diverse Women and Global Women, and serves on the board of ATED, Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development, as well as on the boards of Manukau Institute of Technology, Unitech, and the Cancer Society Auckland Northland. She was previously an advisory board member for NZ Asian Leaders. Ziena is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion and its role in creating Brand New Zealand. Just this week, Ziena received news that she is one of just 2 Kiwis to be recognized in the Campaign Asia Pacific Women to Watch 2020 list, which comprises just 40 leaders. So this brings us to the big umbrella question for today's discussion. How do we leverage and continue to build the strength of Brand New Zealand during a global pandemic and when borders are potentially going to remain closed for some time? We are looking forward to exploring this with Ziena. For context on who is with us online as part of this community, we have around 120 people attending. 20% are CEOs, 14% are board directors and/or chairs, and the rest are a cohort of senior executives from a diverse range of sectors and industries. Haere mai. Some housekeeping matters to address. Firstly, you have all joined this webinar on mute, and please rest assured you're not on video, so you can sit back and relax. You will remain on mute by default, so no need to stress about background noise either. We will also be uploading a recording of this webinar to our website, and also share the slide deck as part of that recording, so no need to worry about writing too many notes. We will send a link to the recording, as well as a link to a short video that we will play later in the webinar. This is because we understand the Zoom streaming controls mean that the resolution of that video might look different to each of you with audio and lagging, and thus the safest way to rewatch it is by clicking the link in the email we send around later. Secondly, we encourage you to participate by asking questions throughout this session. There is a Zoom chat function button, Q&A. Please type in your questions and we will address the most popular ones during our panel session, which I will expand on shortly. Please can we request that you send your questions using the Q&A function instead of the Zoom chat function. Finally, we wanted to share the structure of our webinar today so you know what to expect. Following this introduction, Ziena will be delivering a presentation. Afterward, we will have a dialogue together. For those of you who have regularly attended these webinar series, you will know I have typically been the facilitator, introducing others, but it is now incumbent on me to introduce myself, which can be a humbling task, so please forgive any awkwardness. I'm a consultant with the firm working across all 3 of our offerings, spanning executive search, governance, appointments, and leadership solutions. I have predominantly worked with clients from the public, not-for-profit, arts and culture, and financial services sectors. I have led a number of searches within these sectors, including for CEO appointments and several board chair and non-executive director appointments. It was actually in this capacity that I first had the pleasure of meeting Ziena during the AT'd appointment process. So without further ado, let's launch right in. Please welcome Ziena.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you very much, Renisa, for that very generous introduction. Before I start, I should note that today is rubbish collection day in my suburb. So if you hear some rumbling in the background, that's not me trying to create a new brand for New Zealand. It's just the rubbish truck. So let's launch straight into it. Brand New Zealand in a time of COVID-19. Countries spend millions in promotion to attract buyers for their products and services, skilled migrants, tourism, trade and investment. And while COVID-19 has implications for the movement of people, if international media headlines are anything to go by, New Zealand's brand is arguably stronger now than it has ever been. Now is the time to maximize the opportunity that this presents. My own experience promoting Brand New Zealand started in the early 2000s. As Renisa said, I was head of North Asia Marketing and Communications for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Based in Hong Kong, my job was to build a profile for New Zealand as a trade and investment partner in Greater China, Japan, and Korea, and to demystify the region for Kiwi businesses who at the time were very much focused on Australia, the US, and the UK. We undertook perceptions research, and the sentiment was very much as you can see on the screen. The picture of a clean, green, beautiful country, sheep, mountains, and the one outlier was the King of the Rings. That was what some people called the Lord of the Rings in China. And I think it's really important that we don't underestimate the value of screen production on our brand. A few years later, when I was the New Zealand Trade Commissioner in Singapore, I recall a senior Singaporean minister saying to me that New Zealand needed to be clear about how it wanted to be perceived internationally, otherwise we'd be seen as Asia's retirement village. In the last 15 to 20 years, there has been lots of perceptions research undertaken by government agencies and media firms. There are particular nuances that we need to be mindful of when dealing with different markets. But if I were to generalize, there are some common themes that come up no matter where in the world you go. Our natural beauty, our lifestyle, our Māori culture, the fact that we are fair and trustworthy people who believe in a rules-based order, our creative sector, some of our innovation, and our distance to markets. Generally speaking, people like us, and they like what they perceive New Zealand to be. The Future Brand Country Index measures the strength of perception of countries around the world and the competitive advantage that countries have over their peers as a result. Last year's index, which is the most recent, noted, as you can see on the screen, and it said this about New Zealand. As our world becomes more connected and complex, countries that take decisive action to prioritize quality of life will prevail. New Zealand is paving the way with a national budget based not on traditional measures like productivity and economic growth, but on goals that encourage the well-being of citizens. These forward-looking policies will not only safeguard New Zealand's people, but likely attract future visitors, investors, and citizens. It seems almost prophetic in a COVID-riddled world. Personal choices and shared beliefs are resulting in a pronounced shuffling in the global ranking of nations. The report also noted that a country's position in the world was being influenced a lot more by things other than traditional measures. So increasingly topics such as immigration and social safety net provisions like healthcare and education were seen as being important. Global trends like mindfulness, conscious consumerism, the growth of the gig economy and remote working are reflecting changes in consumer decision-making. For country brands, this shift means that it's important, more than ever before, to showcase the ability to look after the safety, well-being, and happiness of all people. It was my job to promote Brand New Zealand all over Asia for 10 years, and we won many awards for our work too. But there's an important aspect of country branding that is quite different from any other type of branding, which means while you may consider it your job, success isn't just dependent on your actions. Developing and defending a corporate brand can be a tough task in current economic climate. But protecting and promoting a country brand is an altogether different challenge in a significantly interdependent yet increasingly fragile world economy. A country brand is all-encompassing, not just one company, but hundreds of companies. Not just one sector, but several sectors. Not just established businesses, but startups too. Country branding is successful when we all live and breathe the brand. We've talked about it before. Some of you may remember the stadium of 4 million that we promoted for the Rugby World Cup. And today, our response to COVID-19 is hailed around the world because of that collective response. The team of 5 million. We came together and complied with instructions which our leaders gave us, something that hasn't been seen in many other parts of the world. So this then brings me to my next point about leadership. As part of a master's thesis in politics and international relations last year, I analyzed the individual brands of different world leaders and the role that played as their country's brand ambassador, with case studies on Jacinda Ardern, Donald Trump, and Justin Trudeau. Each country puts forward its values to the world. And when it has a leader that epitomizes them, presuming those values resonate globally, the impact of the leader's brand on the country brand is strongly positive. This was especially evident for Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern, with Canadian and New Zealand policy platforms corresponding well with the leaders' self-proclaimed positions. The response of leaders around the world to COVID-19 has had implications for country brands as well. And again, the contrast between Donald Trump and Jacinda Ardern couldn't be starker. I'm sure you've all seen the reference that Donald Trump made about not wanting the US to experience the same surge in cases that we've had here on a day when we had 9 cases and the US had tens of thousands. We've been very fortunate with our leaders in New Zealand. Consider Helen Clark as head of UNDP and now co-chair of a panel reviewing the WHO's handling of the COVID pandemic and the response of governments to the outbreak. Our response to COVID-19, even with this second wave, is considered much stronger than most other developed nations. Surveys, including one by IDP International Education Specialists, of 6,900 prospective international students, ranked our response as the best among destination countries, and New Zealand as the safest country for students and citizens. But what use is a good brand if it isn't being used? As a small country at one end of the world, our distance to markets has often been seen as a curse. In a COVID-19 world, it has been a blessing. However, as a small trading nation, we cannot afford to lock down our engagement with the rest of the world. Smart thinking and technology enable us to remain connected without fully opening borders. So what does this all mean for you as business leaders, and why should you care? I want to spend the next few minutes on the elements of our brand that are still relevant, even if people can't come and enjoy our beautiful landscapes or breathe our clean air. Although I did notice that someone was auctioning COVID-free air on Trade Me. I think at last count it was selling for about $85. Around the world, people trust us. We rank number 1 or in the top 5 globally for matters relating to transparency and democracy. Trust is also reflected in the number of free trade agreements we have internationally. We do what we say we will. And while it may sound a tad boring, we are actually quite predictable in terms of the choices we make and our stand on significant issues. I talked earlier about leader brands. And one of the challenges, that the US faces with its partners around the world is for people to try and reconcile how they have traditionally viewed the US with what the current leader is saying and doing, which are often at odds. Here in New Zealand, we are seen as having integrity. We do the right thing. I remember when I was in Hong Kong, we had an issue with a disease affecting New Zealand tomato plants. We temporarily halted exports of our tomatoes, not because there was anything wrong with them, with the tomatoes themselves, but because the biosecurity of our trading partners mattered to us. That cost us some export dollars, but we gained so much more in reputation, which has longer lasting impacts, including financial. Integrity also requires us to think about where we source from, how we produce what we do, who we partner with and work for. Customers around the world are becoming more discerning. For example, ethical sourcing and good labor conditions matter. I have seen firsthand the impact that Māori culture can have when telling the New Zealand story. You could be at a massive trade show, exhibition halls that extend the length of several rugby fields, and then you start a pōwhiri or a haka, and the entire arena would come to a pause. It is the one thing we have that is uniquely ours and that no other country can claim, unlike claims of being innovative, safe, or having beautiful landscapes. All true, but not just unique to New Zealand. At a recent China Business Summit, one of the themes that recurred throughout the day, from Prime Minister Ardern's speech to that of business leaders, was the importance of Māori culture and heritage when we're engaging offshore. We also know from experience that Māori business delegations do very well in Asia. There's a cultural affinity and shared values. There's an emphasis on building long-term relationships which are mutually beneficial. We are quick to embrace Māori culture, especially offshore, when we see a commercial return. But do our day-to-day business engagements demonstrate Māori values here in New Zealand? Do our initiatives and programs respect tikanga? We know that Māori and Pacific communities are disproportionately impacted as a result of COVID-19. Integrity requires us to do the right thing, not just when it feels right for our purposes. Talk to business partners offshore, and they will tell you that there's something a bit different about Kiwis. Our laid-back, she'll-be-right attitude, our humble nature, our friendly disposition, and number 8 wire mentality. Ernest Rutherford said that when you've never been shown the confines of a box, you always think outside the square. And that manifests itself in the innovations that come out of New Zealand every day. Be that companies like Rocket Lab or Soul Machine's AI digital human, Florence, who is being used by the WHO to provide COVID advice. There's a wealth of amazing work happening in the creative and tech sectors. Work that we can continue to do even with closed borders. Weightless exports have never been more important, not just for the fact that they aren't hampered by borders or the tyranny of distance, but that they also act as an advert for New Zealand. In its time, the Lord of the Rings trilogy probably did more to put New Zealand on the global map than any other campaign that we could have come up with. And remember that that wasn't even its primary objective. But being humble means that we often forget to tell our stories. I can't count the number of times Kiwi exporters have said to me, "My product speaks for itself." And I'm sitting there thinking, but your product can't talk. It's not Florence. We've seen Jacinda Ardern and John Key both being excellent storytellers for New Zealand on the international scene. But we all need to get better at telling our stories and the stories of each other. And given we can't travel, we need to think creatively about how we tell these stories through video messages, social media, international influencers, and so on. We've also seen Kiwi can-do demonstrated in how quickly businesses have adapted For example, fashion businesses producing face masks to meet growing demand. But being laid back can also mean that sometimes we may be perceived as not quite having the same thirst for business or even quality standards that some international markets require. Our clean green image is not just a tourism play. At least it shouldn't be. It underpins a strong sustainability message and commitment to environmental protection that we need to ensure we demonstrate in our businesses. Our well-being budget, which has taken a rather unique turn this year, is a demonstrable commitment to social responsibility. How are your businesses reflecting environmental and social responsibility? There are, of course, also te ao Māori principles, such as whanaungatanga, kotahitanga, and kaitiakitanga. We have an opportunity to apply these principles, not just to our businesses here in New Zealand, but also to take them to the world, demonstrating leadership on an international scale. There are several New Zealand businesses leading in this space. Allbirds, with its commitment to reduce its carbon footprint, or Kono, with its ambition to build a 500-year business, very much focused on legacy and leaving the world better for future generations. And it's not as if we've just started doing this when the rest of the world has woken up to it. I remember promoting New Zealand carbon zero wines in Singapore, the first carbon zero certified wines in the world. Our marketing tagline was "Drink with a clear conscience." Internationally, we are recognized for our nuclear-free policy. What's your organization's nuclear-free policy? I said earlier, the impacts of COVID-19 are being felt disproportionately. The statistics around the proportion of women in unemployment as a result of COVID-19 is absolutely staggering. A crisis is not the time to reduce a focus on diversity and inclusion. It's the time to double down on it. And here's another opportunity for New Zealand to lead on the international stage as a beacon of what an inclusive society can look like. Another aspect of the New Zealand DNA that sets us apart is our ability to work across different sectors, different businesses, to collaborate. I saw this especially in Asia, where even our medium to large companies could be quite small in relation to massive Asian markets. Collaborating to compete helped us have a brand presence and recognition that would be hard to secure otherwise. And that could be seen in multiple ways. Whether it was a New Zealand promotion across more than 100 supermarkets in Singapore, where the country brand helped lift awareness of individual brands, or whether it was companies working together as part of a supply chain to provide a complete solution. In the current environment, collaboration is critical. We've seen a range of innovative solutions where Kiwis have stood up to help each other. The Manaki platform is a good example of this. At the start of the lockdown earlier this year, we saw the launch of Your Creative Business Can Happen Now, a campaign led by a group of creative and tech companies who came together to secure work from international markets in areas including VR, commercials, games, and so on. The premise was that the work could be done from New Zealand a day ahead, while other markets were still in various stages of lockdown. Collaborating to ensure everyone wins is another way to demonstrate leadership. If I were to leave you with 3 things today, they would be this. Firstly, let's become a team of Kiwi storytellers. Tell your story and share the stories of other Kiwi businesses and innovation. Someday, the borders will open and we will be able to welcome tourists, students, and migrants. But we need to ensure that in the meantime, they don't forget us. And in the interim, business hasn't stopped. Our products, our services, our technology, they are still servicing the world. And we need to make sure that the world sees value in them. Part of this is also about telling our stories here in New Zealand. We have so many businesses doing really cool things, and your average Kiwi will have no idea who they are, especially if they aren't in the traditional product sectors like food and beverage. Secondly, live our country values in your day-to-day. Trust is perhaps the most important element of our brand at the moment, and we need to protect it. This comes through the decisions that you make and the actions that you take. How you treat your people, your partners, your customers, your commitment to the environment, your response to social issues. They all tell a story about whether or not you can be trusted. And treating all people well has to be something that we do all the time. Genuine relationships are good for business. Thirdly, if you haven't already taken a digital-first approach in your business where possible, now is the time to do it. COVID-19 has provided a great opportunity to reimagine our economy and our businesses to be a true embodiment of our country brand. Not just clean, green, and new in name, but in ensuring that our products, services, and technology are good for people and the planet now and in the future. I want to leave you with a video which the wonderful team at ATEED made and presented to the world during the last lockdown. It's a great example of how we can continue to engage in these current times and how we highlight to the world what is really important to us. Sit at a distance, stand together. That's how we build our brand in a time of COVID-19.
Stop. Listen. Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother, is breathing. Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, still. Our maunga, our mountains, standing strong. Our moana, our ocean now louder than ever. Our tui and our keriru now need not fight with the daily hum of our busy lifestyles. Our people's waiata, normally loud and joyful, now soft and distant, waiting for the right time to rise again. Our land renewing, replenishing, ready for your return. And our kai, our food, preparing to nourish. Enjoy time with your whānau, your families, your loved ones, and soon we'll unite again. Noho tawhiti tū kotahi. Sit at a distance, stand as one. We, our land, our waters, our people, we aren't going anywhere. Dream, plan. And when the time is right, we welcome you. But for now, listen. Papa Tuanuku is breathing.
Many thanks, Ziena, for that interesting presentation. You have sparked food for thought, weaving in tikanga Māori values and examples of businesses and brands already leading the way, such as Allbirds and Kono. I did chuckle too on the attempted sale of COVID-free air. Keen to dive into our Q&A by first exploring leadership. Looking back at your career, what are the key experiences that have shaped who you are? What have you learned from these formative experiences?
I think the first formative experience actually came as a 16-year-old when I was selected to represent the youth of the South Pacific at a UN forum in The Hague. And that summit was the precursor to what we now know as the Sustainable Development Goals. As delegates of the Youth Forum, all of us representatives from around the world were developing a white paper with our asks for health ministers from around the world who were there at the same time as part of a ministerial forum. And there I learned the importance of words, the value of compromise and of collaboration. You know, we'd be working into the wee hours of the night trying to finalize our white paper. But it was taking so long because you needed to incorporate the needs and requirements of people from all around the world, and what might work for one country didn't work for others. So that was a good lesson very early on in life. My offshore roles, the ones in, going to Hong Kong, Singapore, and Delhi, going to markets where I had never lived. I didn't speak the language. I didn't really know anyone when I first arrived. I didn't have networks there. You realize very, very quickly that you are only as good and as effective as your team. And you also understand that, you don't have all the answers. You will never have all the answers. You just need to be prepared to ask the right questions. The other aspect that I found that is really important is relationships. The higher up you go, the smaller your circle can sometimes feel like. And it's really important to have a good network of people around you who you trust and who you can engage with, who become a sounding board for you and support for you in the same way that you would be for them. And the one last thing I would say is that, I think you learn a lot from failure, perhaps a lot more than you learn from successes. And you need to have the courage to admit that you failed and then to look at why you failed, what went wrong, and how you could improve on that going forward.
Thank you. It's interesting when we've done these series, it harkens back to a piece of research that we did on CEOs and developing the next generation of leaders for Aotearoa. And that piece about having a sounding board or a feedback loop from people around you that can hold up the mirror and, have those tough conversations with you has been a recurring theme. So it's been really interesting to hear that many leaders have spoken about the value of that. Did you have any leadership role models who inspired you, and what have you learned from them?
I have many role models who have and continue to inspire me in different ways. And from them, what I have learned is that leadership is really about growing people, inspiring, motivating, energizing, and empowering people to reach their full potential. And it's about creating more leaders. At its core, leadership is about service. I mean, for me at least. And if you're not willing to serve, I don't think you can lead. The other point I'd make about role models is, I think often when we think of role models, we tend to think of people who are older than us. And most of the time, that is true. But I'm especially heartened to see some of, our young people and what they are doing. Last weekend, so the weekend before lockdown, I was in Wellington with the Asian New Zealand Foundation and a group called the 25 to Watch. So there's 25 young people aged 25 or under last year when they were selected, who are seen as, people who are doing great things in terms of the Asian-New Zealand relationship, but who have the potential to do a lot more. Amongst them are people working on climate change activism, period poverty, culture, technology solutions. It's really, really heartening to see that and to see our young people acting as role models. I've also seen some terrible examples, Ranisa. As a leader, you have to be prepared to make tough decisions. And one area I find that we could be better at in New Zealand is having some of those tough conversations, particularly in terms of performance. We don't like confrontation as a people. And often when you don't address issues, it implies that you're actually okay with behavior or poor performance. And that's not a good thing either.
No, that's very, very true. I'm keen to stay on this brand New Zealand theme with the international lens. What would you say are the unique characteristics of Kiwi leaders that help us thrive globally?
I think it goes back to, what I talked about in the presentation around integrity, fairness, a sense of responsibility towards people and the environment, and an ability to adapt and be flexible. Our leaders are real and humble. If you think of our heroes, people like Sir Edmund Hillary and Dame Anne Salmon, even our business leaders, they aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. They're people who wouldn't ask their team to do something that they wouldn't be willing to do themselves. They're quite comfortable in their own skin. They're authentic. And the other thing that I think differentiates New Zealand leaders is that our leaders are actually incredibly accessible. We don't really have hierarchical structures in New Zealand. And that's a big, it makes for a big impression overseas when people can access leaders directly.
Keen to pivot to brand. In your experience of helping brand New Zealand internationally, what helps us stand out from other national brands? What are the USPs? And I know that you've touched on this in your presentation.
Yeah, our products and services are genuinely good. If you look at the food sector as an example, one of the infographics that I had on the screen was our food safety record, #1 in the world. That and our sustainable practices are a good differentiator. Integrity is key. We can be trusted, and we work more collaboratively than competitively. I genuinely feel that most New Zealand companies work in ways with their international partners that are focused on mutual returns. Our environmental and social credentials. Okay, so we acknowledge in New Zealand that we still have a lot of work to do, but if you're comparing us with some other countries around the world, we actually do pretty okay. That doesn't mean we don't have work to do. It just means that we are better than some of the countries that we're competing with. We are hospitable people. We develop good relationships. But one of the things that I'd caution is that, we have to be careful, because you can't just assume that simply having a product or service from New Zealand means that it'll sell. It won't, okay? You've still got to be servicing a need in a market of, overseas, wherever you're selling to. And you've also got to promote your product or service. Just the simple fact that it's from New Zealand doesn't make it go off the shelves, or doesn't make it someone buy your technology.
Thank you. Keen to learn about the secrets to your success. What were the tactics that you used to help get New Zealand products into Asian supermarkets, for example, during your career?
I think, as I said earlier, I've been very lucky, and for anyone promoting New Zealand overseas, we are fortunate that we have good products or services we are promoting that we believe in. You talked about the supermarkets, and I'll get to that, but as an example, my last role in Asia required me to promote New Zealand education across South and Southeast Asia. I came to New Zealand 20 years ago as an international student, and my New Zealand tertiary education changed the course of my life. So I feel very passionate about it. And so it was never hard for me to promote New Zealand education, whether that was to foreign governments or parents in international markets or educational institutions. I think the other secret to our success has been having a really clear understanding of what the market needs are and how our offering helps to address those. Having strong in-market relationships, understanding the culture, knowing what our competitors are doing so that we can see what's working or not working for them, not being afraid to try creative new strategies. Some of what we did from a marketing perspective was, fairly new at the time. I remember in Korea about 15 years ago, we ran a campaign, innovation and culture showcase called New Zealand Unlimited. And the large chunk of marketing for that focused on digital channels, which was very, very new for New Zealand to be doing, and for many other countries to be doing at the time. In India, so cricket in India is a lot more than rugby's to New Zealand. So we used cricketers as brand ambassadors for New Zealand there, because that's what works in that market. Some of the marketing you'll see offshore can, from a New Zealand perspective, is quite cheesy. But if it works in the market, then, that's what you do. And most importantly, I think having a great team. And by team, I mean the NZ Inc. team. So we are all too small individually, as government agencies, as businesses, able to make a massive impact. But when we work together, that's when magic happens. And I've seen that in so many ways. I mean, one of the initiatives, if you like, that I was fortunate enough to work in my time in Hong Kong was the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement signing. And you saw how all the different government agencies, how businesses and business leaders came together to achieve that for New Zealand. You know, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade on the negotiation side, NZT on the leveraging side, businesses coming to the party with our biggest business delegation to China ever. So that's when you start to see the magic happen, when everyone's working together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating because I've had the delight of speaking to you earlier as an avid fan of Vogel's bread. I know during your time that was one of the products that reached the Asian supermarket shelves, and a myriad of other products, and perhaps things have changed since then, but that was quite fascinating for me. This is a harder question, but if you had the same challenge today, if you were in the same role and you were still tasked with taking New Zealand brands overseas and helping them gain traction in this COVID context, what would you do? What would be your advice to businesses in that same situation now?
I think at the moment, it's absolutely essential to ensure that we're working hard to keep our brand top of mind. You know, we can't travel. And even for goods exports, there will be occasions when products don't arrive on time. So maintaining profile, maintaining visibility, and maintaining relationships in the current environment are absolutely critical. You know, leveraging on the ground connections, be that if you're in market presence, if you have in market presence, you know, using NZT representatives, using your agents or other partners that you have, that is critical. That's more important than it has ever been. And a digital first approach is critical, you know, and the beauty with digital is that you're able to get so much real-time analytics in terms of what's working and what's not working, so you can adapt accordingly. And it also allows a level of targeting that's, you know, not always possible with other channels.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so keen to take questions from our participants now. The first one is in a contrast to the Kono and Allbirds examples. Can you give us some examples of when companies have not succeeded in taking their brands or products overseas? And in your view, what are some of the common reasons why they were not successful?
So I can only speak from an Asia perspective, as you know, that's where I've worked. And some of the common pitfalls around not doing appropriate due diligence on partners. So, you know, just because someone's taken you to dinner or to play a game of golf doesn't mean they're ready to sign a contract with you. Still need to do your homework. Failing to understand all the regulatory requirements of different markets. You know, if you've gone into Singapore doesn't mean you'll get into Indonesia or Malaysia. Every country has its own systems. Not understanding the cultural nuances of business in what are very different markets from New Zealand. You know, and sometimes there's a lack of sophistication in the way we target our customers. So we promote products via channels that aren't relevant for our target customer segment. You know, with education, for example, we always had an always on digital strategy, which was aimed at ensuring that, you know, that level of awareness of New Zealand was kept up. But then we'd complement that with various activations, which were more focused on increasing consideration and preference. So for example, you know, if you're selling a product targeted at mothers and they are mostly getting their information from or buying through live stream channels, but you are doing an offline activation campaign, that's not going to work because they're not actually seeing any of those things. I've seen New Zealand companies trying to sell premium products in outlets where their price points are completely out of sync with where, you know, they're promoting their products, or instances where businesses have failed to understand the difference between a volume or a value play. And sometimes it's just not having the grunt behind you to be able to sustain that long-term commitment that's required to be successful internationally. It takes a lot longer than it is to try and sell something within New Zealand.
No, that's interesting. Pivoting back to that leadership perspective, to what extent do you think these successes and failures, both sides, were related to competencies of the leaders or the business owners?
You know, I think even where it's not directly related to the competencies of the leader, leaders need to take responsibility, you know, even for the fact that they may not have had the right people or resource their people accordingly. So those are some of the key things that you see.
Thank you. I've got a question from an audience member. While we are good at creativity and innovation, there have been other comments that we are unable to scale and commercialize many innovations because our leaders and business owners don't know how to do so. Keen to get your views.
Yeah, that that's been seen in a number of sectors in New Zealand, and part of that is the fact that New Zealand businesses, because of the size of our domestic market, start their international journey a lot earlier in their life cycle than companies from other countries around the world. So that's something that we do see, and that we do continue to see. It's something we've been talking about for a number of years. But on the flip side of that, we are seeing a determination and a willingness from companies to work more and more together. And the example that I gave earlier, particularly in that, with the creative and tech sector, and how those companies banded together in the middle of lockdown, because all of them were feeling hurt with the economic impact. So they banded together to promote New Zealand internationally together, and that worked for them. So it can be done. But we need to get better at talking with each other and finding partners here.
Yeah, the co-optation concept is hopefully going to grow in momentum. We've recently done some work in the wine sector, and it's just too hard for the niche brands to shine versus New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc or, Marlborough brands instead of the specific ones. And that banding together to tell that collective NZ story has been much more fruitful for them financially as well. So there's another question here. While you have spent a lot of time helping to take New Zealand brands overseas, how do you think our local brands can compete with international brands that are coming to New Zealand?
I think in the same way that we compete with them in international markets, and only here we have hometown advantage, and with COVID we have seen a reinforcing of commitment to buying local and supporting local. And as I said earlier, given the size of our domestic economy, our businesses start exporting a lot earlier. So that proves challenging for them, but that also provides them strengths which they should be able to leverage against international brands in New Zealand. I would also suggest that our own brands in New Zealand you'd hope that they would understand the needs of New Zealand customers a lot better than international brands might.
Look, this next question is quite a toughie. So I'll read it in its full, but before going there, I think what I would preface by saying is it's interesting in that it's reflecting on social issues. And I know you recently published an article for Stuff, which was a thought piece on Asian communities and how we can better partner with Māori in, firstly, just having respect for mana whenua, and then working together to really help that brand New Zealand piece through that lens. And what was quite brave was you called out inherent racism within the Asian community, and by that I do mean Indian communities as well. I'm Indian, so I hope it's okay for me to say this, in that, we're not free of blame, right? So we need to be really mindful about how we talk about communities in New Zealand, and that we don't make it worse. And you wrote an article about it. So I think I'm pretty sure you'll have some thoughts on this question, but it is a toughie. So go with me on this. Ziena, you referred to the Wellbeing Index and that our budget was not based on traditional measures like productivity and economic growth, but on goals that encourage the well-being of our citizens. Although promoted by the Prime Minister, it is simply not true. Affordable housing, mental health, teenage suicides, and child poverty, just to name a few, are all goals for the well-being of citizens. But it's worse now than it was before this government came to power. So how is it that we are telling the world that our budgets are based on the well-being of our citizens?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So just to note that on the slide, what I was quoting was actually how, something that Future Brand, when they were doing the analysis of different country brands. So that was Future Brand's view of our well-being budget. That was not me or the government promoting that as something. Having said that though, as I mentioned earlier, we recognize that we have a long way to go in New Zealand, whether that's on social indexes or whether that's, in terms of our environmental record and what we could do. And yes, absolutely, there's a lot of work to do in that space, and we need to do it. And we can't go internationally, promoting these things unless they are true. So totally agree with that. The point that I would make, though, relating to that, though, is that, yes, it's not great here, but it's actually worse in some other countries. Now, that doesn't mean we rest on our laurels. Absolutely not. It means we work harder to try and improve the situation here. But internationally, when people see us, some of those things are not visible to them, or if they are, our situation is better than what they have in their own country.
No, absolutely. I've got another question about market penetration and growth. We continue to see some companies enter overseas markets, perhaps with an amount of naivety. Are you surprised that they have not learned from others' experiences? And what advice would you have for these companies?
No, I'm not surprised, because that speaks to who we are as a people, right? We have that can-do spirit and that she'll be right attitude. And so off we go, internationally, even perhaps when we are not ready for it or we haven't prepared for it. So for businesses in that situation, there is a range of support available from, local economic development agencies and chambers of commerce, but also from the likes of New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. And NZT recently launched a platform called MyNZTE. It has a wealth of information available on it, all free, all on demand. And that's perhaps one of the first places that companies should look at if they're looking to go offshore.
Thank you. I've got another question from a participant. How important is it to brand New Zealand that we're seen to be pulling our weight as opposed to freeloading on other countries, such as our investment in things like science and research, where we both contribute to and benefit from efforts globally?
Could you repeat that question so I understand?
Sure. Or how would you rate the importance of brand New Zealand being seen to be pulling our own weight instead of freeloading from other countries for things such as investing in science and research? Yeah,
sure. I think it's absolutely important that we are seen as pulling our weight, and this is one of the things, important in the research and innovation space, but important generally, and I talked about leader brands, for example, and that relation between how a country is perceived in terms of, following a rules-based order, following international organizations and the mandates that come with those. All of those things, they say a lot about us as a nation. So yeah, we need to play our part. We cannot be freeloading.
And it's interesting, we've done work with a number of innovation organizations here, and it's not that the ideas are lacking. We're quite creative and innovative. It's probably that storytelling piece and the communication that's probably lacking, and thus a perception of freeloading is probably part of that as well. We've got someone who's asked a question and they're joining us from Singapore. So it's possibly someone that you may have crossed paths with back in your day. They say, I do see lots of New Zealand brands here in Singapore, but they can't articulate the USP to the consumer here. What can they do better?
Tell their story better. And part of telling the story better is understanding what's important to the Singaporean customer. Okay, because, I remember companies coming up with their products and saying, oh, we are number one in New Zealand and number two in Australia. And I'd say, well, actually, you just came through immigration and customs, you're in a different country. And being number one in New Zealand or Australia doesn't actually matter here. So it's understanding for, your product or service, whatever it is that you're selling, what aspect of it actually meets the needs of Singaporean customers and aligning with that, so that you can be seen to be servicing their needs and their desires and meeting those.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, and since we've only got 5 minutes left, it might be useful just to do a quick wrap up. I want to ask a question about something that
We appear to have lost Renisa. All right. Well, I'm not sure what Renisa was going to ask. And I actually can't see the questions from the audience. So I'm just going to do a wrap up for everyone here. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that was useful in terms of sharing some insights of how Brand New Zealand and the values inherent in Brand New Zealand can be applied day to day in what we do in our businesses and in our lives here. We identified a range of areas where there's still a lot of work to do, and we need to be true to those values. And if integrity is going to be one of the key pillars of our brand, then we need to ensure that we are doing the right thing. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope that was useful. We'll send you the link to the video, to the 80 video, as well as the video of this webinar if you want to see it again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.